En México, 4 de cada 10 personas no tiene acceso al Internet, una herramienta fundamental no solo para desarrollarnos como humanos, en educación y en salud, sino también para el crecimiento de nuestros países. Se entiende que 10% de penetración de Internet en un país significa 1% adicional de crecimiento económico al año. Esta semana platicamos con Vint Cerf, el Chief Evangelist del Internet para Google y también reconocido como uno de los padres, uno de los fundadores, uno de los pioneros del Internet. Hablamos sobre México, hablamos sobre inclusión digital y hablamos sobre el futuro del Internet. Espero que lo disfruten. Vint Cerf, welcome.
Thank you, Arturo. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you.
And it's a pleasure to have you. Let me tell you a quick story. My 9-year-old daughter asked me a couple of weeks ago, who invented the internet? And I said to her, well, why don't we ask the internet? And so we did. And the internet said, Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. Now, for those of our listeners who might have been already born into the digital era, can you please take us back and tell us first, what does that mean? And second, what did you think at the time about the internet when you were doing this?
So you realize, of course, that this is a question that could easily go on for rather a long time. I'll try very hard to be terse. The project was initiated by the American Defense Department way back literally in 1968, quite a long time ago. They were trying to find ways of getting the computers that were being used by research organizations, mostly universities, to study artificial intelligence and computer science. Remember, this is way back in the 1960s. The Defense Department was very interested in these ideas. So they had a dozen universities, each with their own computing resources, working on these problems, and they wanted them to share their resources so that they could advance the state of the art more quickly. People could share computing capability, could share software. So they said, well, we need to hook the computers together somehow. And they decided to use a very unusual communications technology, which was considered heresy at the time. It's called packet switching, which you can think of as electronic postcards, things that have two addresses, from addresses, and some data, and you fling them into the net, they get switched at the speed of light. Very different from the telephone circuit switching system that had been around for, by that time, nearly 100 years. So the Defense Department said, no, we want to figure out how to build this network. And I got involved in this when I was still a graduate student at UCLA. One of the guys who helped design that network was Robert Kahn, who at the time was at a company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman. And after the success of this effort, we got everything to work. We got the network to work. We got the computers to hook up to the network and talk to each other. And then somebody invented electronic mail around 1971. And of course, everybody got excited about that because it meant you didn't have to be online at the same time in order to communicate, unlike a phone call where, both parties have to be there at the same time. So email becomes the most popular application, but remote access to time-shared resources, again, very, very important. File transfers between computers, also a very critical application. So all of that success emerges by 1972 in a big public demonstration of the technology. And the following spring, Bob Kahn goes from the Bolt, Beranek and Newman company to the Defense Department, to the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And I go from UCLA to Stanford University to join the faculty. And Bob shows up in my lab in the spring of 1973, literally 50 years ago. And he says, we have a problem. And my reaction was, what do you mean we? And he said, well, the success of the ARPANET has led the Defense Department to wonder whether it could use computers for command and control. Well, what does that imply? Well, first of all, the computers had to be small enough that you could put them in mobile vehicles, tanks and armored personnel carriers, ships at sea, Generally, no problem with space there. Those are pretty big. And aircraft, so they can't be too heavy. And the implication of all that is that you had to use radio in order to communicate, because you can't use wires. You know, the tanks run over the wires and they break and all that stuff. So he said, we got these. I'm now working, that is Bob Kahn, I'm working on a mobile packet radio system, a packet satellite system for long distance communication, in addition to the now existing ARPANET. And then, although unknown to us in the spring, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center down the street from my Stanford lab was working on Ethernet, Bob Metcalf and David Boggs, high-speed coaxial cable digital communication. So we're scratching our heads trying to figure out, how do you connect these different kinds of packet switch nets to each other in a way that is reliable and still permits computers that are made by different manufacturers to successfully talk to each other? And that was the internet problem. And within about 6 months, we figured out a way to do that. We published a paper which came out in May of 1974. So our motivation was primarily a requirement coming from the Defense Department saying, can you help us use computers in command and control, with all the implications of that. But we'd already had 4 years of experience with the ARPANET and its uses by the research community. And we could already see the beginnings of social networking, believe it or not, that far back. Mailing lists, email distribution lists had formed very quickly after the initial invention of this email stuff. And some of them were clearly socially oriented. The first one I joined was called Sci-Fi Lovers. You know, it was a list that had a debate about which sci-fi authors were the best.
The other version of Tinder, perhaps.
I guess you could say that. So we would have our arguments about who were the best writers and all this stuff. Then the next one I joined was called Yum Yum, and that turned out to be a restaurant review of restaurants in the Palo Alto area, because it was hosted by Stanford University. So from that perspective, not only did we see social engagement, but of course we saw people using these tools to get work done. And so we were very excited about that. And the idea of being able to overlay that on an indeterminate number of different networks, all interconnected with each other, all independently operated, was a very appealing vision. And so even in this early stage in the 1970s, we had aspirations for much of this. What we didn't anticipate, to be quite honest, was the framework that Tim Berners-Lee introduces in the late 1980s. 1989, he begins working on this World Wide Web idea, which doesn't really surface publicly until 1991 in December. And even then, it wasn't terribly visible. And it was a text-based thing. But two guys at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, come up with the idea of a graphical user interface with a browser program they called Mosaic. And of course, they released this publicly because they're doing work in a publicly supported institution. And of course, now everybody sees the internet through the lens of formatted text and imagery and eventually streaming audio and video. And of course, it takes the world by storm. You know, millions of downloads, and it got so visible that a guy named Jim Clark, who had founded Silicon Graphics, which is a company that made hardware to help the film industry do animations and things like that, took one look at this and said, you know, there's a there, and goes and brings Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina and others from NCSA to the West Coast to start a company called Netscape Communications, which makes browsers and servers. And so in 1994, they begin the operation. In 1995, they go public, and the stock goes through the roof, and the dot boom is on, because the venture capital people are saying, this internet is a big deal. I'll invest in anything that looks like it might have something to do with the internet. And so this boom goes until about April of 2000, when a lot of these new startups ran out of capital. And then died because the CEOs conflated capital and revenue. And especially in the position you're in, that they are not the same thing. Capital is finite. Revenue is supposed to keep going in order to sustain and grow the company. So some of them didn't know that. So the bodies of dead, startups were all over the place. But internet continues to grow, and other companies that got started during that period have survived, Google being one of them. It got started in 1998. So I know that's a very long answer, but we didn't anticipate everything, but we actually were working with a packet voice and packet video as part of the research program as far back as the late 1970s and early 1980s, but we couldn't do very much of it because the data rates were not very good. The backbone speed of the original ARPANET was 50 kilobits a second. Today's optical fiber networks, as you know, operate at 400 gigabits per second per optical channel, and that will soon, I think, become 800 gigabits a second per optical channel. And you might wonder how on earth could anyone consume all that capacity? And all we have to do is to look back at the last 3 years of the pandemic to appreciate people all over the world who are doing what we are doing right this moment.
And we're going to talk about the role that the internet played during the pandemic, because I guess no one could have thought of a more natural, powerful experiment, unwanted, for our digital lives than a pandemic like the one that we just had. But Vint, I'm fascinated by this story. The story of the internet is an amazing story of human achievement. It's an amazing story of innovation that involves both the public sector as a critical investor and component, but also a lot of private sector innovation. So a perfect alliance. And what I also find really remarkable is how many of the ideas that we think are new, artificial intelligence has just kind of hit the world's imagination a few weeks ago, have been there for so long, social media being one of them, etc. As an internet pioneer, you are Google's chief internet evangelist. Mexico is a very religious country, so I'll use the analogy. Okay. Do you feel that the internet needs a reformation?
Well, I don't want to overstate the power and impact of the internet, but it's fair to say that it has had a remarkable effect. It has made it possible for people to get access to information at their fingertips, which otherwise would have been very difficult or time-consuming, like finding the right library to get the books that you need to get the information, or finding the right people. So it's been a powerful amplifier of our ability to obtain, consume, produce, and use information. And certainly my company, Google, was all in on the ability to organize the world's information and try to make it universally accessible and useful. So internet demonstrated its extraordinary capacity, especially during this pandemic period. And you very correctly pointed out the partnership between the public and private sector. But perhaps even more important is the amazing degree of collaboration that the internet induced in people's minds. It took an army of people to build the internet, and it takes an army of people to keep it running today. The flexibility of its architecture and the design parameters for operation were intentionally extremely flexible and open. The protocols were done in an open way. The current Internet Engineering Task Force is an open place where internet standards are made. Anyone is free to come and join the effort. You don't have to become a member, you just have to show up. There aren't any membership fees or anything like that. So this collaborative environment has induced an enormous amount of creativity and invention, some of it proprietary and a lot of it publicly available. So, and I'm very proud of the fact that the architecture, the technical architecture, has given this much freedom to everyone. So as an example, the layered architecture has a very powerful element called the Internet Protocol layer. That's the electronic postcards world. But then above that is something called TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, which is an end-to-end reliable communications path. But, if you don't particularly like the suite of available protocols in this architecture, you can add your own. And so at Google, we added a new one called Quick, which is in parallel with TCP and TLS, the security structure, and allows for some fast recovery and parallel channels within a common quick connection. But a more important example is Tim Berners-Lee and his colleagues who invented the World Wide Web, because they put a whole new layer of protocol on top of TCP/IP called HTTP, the Hypertext Transport Protocol, and the system accommodates that. I mean, it doesn't run away from innovation. When optical fiber networks were invented, we just swept that in underneath the IP layer of protocol. So this freedom to invent and to explore and expand the system and incorporate new ideas is what has given it such longevity. I mean, we turned the system on in operationally in 1983, 10 years after the conceptual birth of the system. And it's been running ever since and growing ever since. So, I mean,
it's had an amazing impact in the world, as you said. We lived it during the pandemic, but we've seen it before. You and I were together in Palo Alto, I think in December of 2018, when the world reached the first 50% of people connected to the internet. And you've been a huge advocate of internet for all. Latin America and Mexico, my country, does not have that 50% penetration yet. Can you tell us first about your personal connection to Mexico? And second, how do you think about digital inclusion and the decade that is ahead of us?
Oh, thank you so much for asking the question. I have a family connection, which I'm very happy and proud of. Our daughter-in-law is Natalia Almada, who is a very well-known Mexican film producer. She's received significant awards for her documentary work. She has had 2 Best Director awards from Sundance, the famous film festival in Utah, and a MacArthur Award for her work. Her great-grandfather was the president of Mexico, Plutarco Calles, who was actually a pretty bad guy, based on what I understand. And she did a documentary about him, and she didn't pull any punches. So, and the entire family is involved in film production. Our younger son is a cinematographer in Los Angeles, and Natalia's husband, our son David, is a film sound editor and composer of music for her documentaries. So, so we have that family connection, but there's another professional connection with a man named Alejandro Pisanti, who is at the UNAM, a professor of chemistry, but more important was the vice chairman of the Internet Corporation for Assigning Names and Numbers, which I chaired for 8 years in the early part of the 21st century. He is a tireless advocate and the organizer and head of the Internet Society in Mexico, a spokesperson for openness and expansion of the Internet, and a dear friend. So I have many reasons to feel strongly connected to Mexico. And there is one more, Arturo, that I feel compelled to mention. When I was a young man, I used to drive with my father and his friends to Ensenada to do fishing. We'd go and catch rockfish, and we would, smoke them to preserve them and so on. It turns out more recently I've become, well, actually for some time now, I've been a collector of wine, and I've discovered that that there are wine vineyards now in Ensenada that produce very good quality wine. And I have some in my cellar just 20 feet from here. So another attraction for me for Mexico.
Vint, that's great to have you so connected to Mexico. So how do we get a country like Mexico or any other to 100% of internet penetration?
So that's a great, wonderful question, and it brings up the whole notion of digital inclusion. I have another hat which I wear as chairman of the board of the Marconi Society, and it has a whole program on digital inclusion, and that you are well aware of, and in fact, MasterCard has participated in. And we've learned a great deal about the challenges associated with getting people online. It's not just a question of getting physical facilities in place, although they clearly are needed, whether it's cell towers for 5G or someday 6G, or optical fiber networks to connect the cell towers together, or coaxial cable networks to connect people's homes, or other radio-based systems, Wi-Fi for local communication. And more recently, of course, the low Earth orbiting satellite systems like Starlink and others that can give access to literally any square inch of the Earth if they get all of the constellation up and running. So getting the physical facilities in place, of course, is very important. But it isn't enough to just do that. For one thing, in order to get there, to get to this destination, we first have to be able to evaluate each locale and ask how ready is it for internet use? The readiness for the physical infrastructure, readiness for applying the technology to daily chores, useful business opportunities, government applications and services. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we measure our readiness? Where do we know where effort is needed to raise the level of readiness so that we can make use of the investment to put internet in place? And that leads to all kinds of other things, like how do we map the availability of internet and its operation in parts of the world where it is operating, but how well is it operating? How do we measure that? How do we continue to measure that to see how well we're doing? So mapping is a big issue. What about the economics of all this? What can each locale sustain in terms of affordability? And what cost is going to be incurred in bringing the service to that locale? Is it sustainable? Is the business model going to make it work all right? And what applications are supportable and what applications are needed in that particular locale? So there's this list of things that we've learned we have to answer or consider in order to effectively bring internet in a useful way to populations that don't have access to it. And I welcome the work that MasterCard has been doing to try to understand the answers to some of those questions, especially where economics is so critical, in order to make sure that when you put energy into building access to the internet, it will be rewarded, and particularly the users will be rewarded with something that they can use on a day-to-day basis.
Vint, I'm fascinated also by the fact that you were working on the notion of artificial intelligence from before the internet was created, before all of this that we've been talking about. How have you changed your notion of what artificial intelligence is and what it can do, and how do you see the future of it?
Well, first of all, let me disabuse you of the notion that I am an expert in artificial intelligence and I've been working on it since 1962. I have not. Okay. I've been an admirer of the problem and sort of at the edges of it because of my career in computer science and because of the universities I've been at, either as a student or as a member of the faculty, Stanford being one of the major players in artificial intelligence way back in the 1960s, along with Carnegie Mellon and MIT and others. So it's gone through several stages, and you'll hear people talking about AI winters when people's skepticism was so high that the funding agencies didn't support it very much. So there have been ups and downs. There was an early attempt to write very explicit software to try to make systems do something smart, playing games, for example, that people are good at, like chess and so on. Then an attempt was made. That worked, but not terribly well, and it didn't end up with very many good applications. Then there was an attempt to do what were called expert systems, where you wrote a bunch of statements that said, if this is true, and the following conditions are true, then this is the conclusion you should reach. And this set of rules, if then else rules, could interact based on input. So you put some input into the system and the rules get triggered, and then they have outputs which trigger other rules, and eventually something pops out the other side. For example, a medical diagnosis. If the patient exhibits these parameters and characteristics, then these rules fire, and then you ask some more questions about the patient, and you finally come up with a diagnosis. That sort of worked. And it gave encouragement, but it turned out that the number of rules you had to write to extract knowledge out of the brains of the physicians was so huge that you would end up sometimes with a mass of rules, some of which contradicted each other. And so it was not a scalable system. So this sort of AI kind of lingers for a while, with people poking at the edges. And then an idea which has been around since 1964, which is neural networks, is revived. Now, the original neural network work was a single layer neural structure, and it was demonstrated by Marvin Minsky and Papert at MIT that the single layer neural network didn't work very well. And so they published a book called Perceptrons, and they said they don't work. And suddenly all the AI research money dried up. But there were people who didn't give up on this basic idea. Somehow the idea, you have a box full of neurons and they have various weights associated with them, and you poke an input in at the top. That input gets managed and somehow calculated against the various neural weights, and something pops out the bottom. What happened I would say, a couple of decades back is that the few people who were so persistently working on this realized that their hardware was available now at that time, which wasn't available before, that allowed them to build a very deep multi-layer network, 50, 100, 500 layers deep. And the reason that turns out to be so dramatically powerful is that the amount of state information that this high level, very deep neural network can hold is enormous. And so you feed information into the top in the training session, and you put weights in that could start out being random weights for these hundreds of layers. But as the output, with random output pops out the bottom, then you provide feedback that says, well, you didn't get that right, and here, this would get you closer to the answer, and you back propagate that through the multi-layer neural network, changing the weights on the various neurons and the way in which they're interconnected. And you continue to do this training. It takes a lot of work and time and effort to do this. Lots and lots of input is needed. But in the end, you end up with a system that is strikingly capable of doing such things as machine language translation from one language to another, speech understanding, speech synthesis, automatic captioning, image recognition, and that could lead to diagnosis. For example, if you're looking at images of cells and could identify that this one is cancerous and that one is not. More recently, one of the most dramatic results came out of a company called DeepMind, which is a sister company to Google, where I work. And they were asking the question, we know that DNA is interpreted in the body and it produces proteins. And the question is, how do the proteins fold up? Why do we care? Well, it turns out that the folded form of a protein is what allows it to interact with different parts of the body or different cells or different other complex molecules. It's like, a key and a lock fitting together. So the question is, well, how many kinds of proteins might be produced by human DNA? And the answer is about 200 million. So the question is, well, what do they look like? And the answer is nobody knows, until they tackled the problem with an artificially intelligent system that had been trained using human input on successful foldings of the proteins. So they actually produced 200 million foldings of all the various possible proteins that the body could produce. Now that just sounds like, okay, well, that's kind of like a parlor trick, so why does we matter? Why does that matter? Of course, the answer is understanding drugs and how they interact with the human body is understanding their folded structure, and the place where a protein might attach to a cell, for example, is determined by the folded shape and the shape of that receptor. So now we know what those look like, and that means we might be able to invent new drug therapies, given our knowledge of what foldings are beneficial. And so, it's a dramatic piece of work that we could not have done manually, I don't think. So we're all very excited now about artificial intelligence. However, given half a chance here, I feel compelled to say that it doesn't always work right. And that's our big challenge, is figuring out how to make these things work in a reliable way so that they don't produce unexpected and potentially harmful outcomes.
I love the analogy of this network going back to the internet. You can think of a country or all of humanity as being a bunch of nodes, every human being a node, and the internet, the one thing that started finally connecting us all without having to be physically present. So as you see the future of the internet, and you think of the power that it has to connect people, to empower people, to educate people, how do you think you would, if you had the power to change anything, what would you change?
Well, the hardest thing to change is human nature, and one of the most disappointing aspects of internet is the fact that people abuse it. We see this is true of every tool you can think of. A hammer can build a house, and it can beat somebody over the head, and it's the human agency that decides which of those uses are chosen. And so the internet, like every other really powerful tool, has abusers who take advantage of its power to harm other people or at least do things in their own interest, but not in the interest of others. Well, that observation has not escaped legislators as well as the general public and technologists like you and me. And the result is that there's a great deal of concern over how to blunt the negative effects and potential harmful applications of this powerful technology, while at the same time preserving what is, without doubt, the most powerful way in which we have learned a new way in which we've learned to interconnect with each other and with information, and with powerful tools to help us aggregate, discover, use, and apply information. So how do we do that? Well, that's hard. And coming up with regulatory constraints is a topic of the day. Figuring out how to do that without either fragmenting the internet or impeding its ability to be useful is a central challenge, certainly in my world as chief internet evangelist, where policy turns out to play a very big role. So we have to work hard to figure out how to do that. And it's an international problem, because the network, which is designed to connect the entire world without paying any attention at all to international boundaries. And the little packets have no idea they've gone from the US to Mexico to Honduras to further south. So the fact that they don't know that means that someone who does not have your best interest at heart might be in country A, and the victim might be in country B. And even if we know that there's somebody in country A doing harm to somebody in country B, countries A and B need to have some reciprocal agreement to help track down the bad guy in country A. And that requires negotiations and treaties and rules of the road and protections of people's privacy. We want to hold people accountable for bad behavior. We want to hold institutions accountable and even countries accountable. On the one side, but second, we want to protect human rights in such a system. And so that means that privacy is still important, but we can't let privacy dominate to allow harmful behaviors to get away with unaccountably. There's another little piece to this peroration, and that's agency. We need to give people and institutions and countries the agency to protect themselves against harmful behaviors. Sometimes strong authentication is a critical element of that, as you would know in your world, because strong authentication is fundamental in financial transactions. You do not want it to be easy for someone to pretend to be you and spend your money for you without your permission. So these various technical tools need to be applied in order to assist in giving agency for safety and security. And rules of the road have to be developed, and treaties have to be built to allow countries to cooperate with each other and with the private sector in order to hold parties accountable.
Vint, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. We covered the history of the internet, the promise of AI, and how to get Mexico to internet for all in 30 minutes. You are not just a pioneer of the internet, you're one of the most brilliant minds that we have today thinking about digital inclusion and these issues. You are the Morpheus of my version of the Matrix. And I'd love to talk to you again soon. So take care. Thank you, Vint.
Well, thank you, Arturo, and thank you for the work that you do in this same domain. It's all I can tell you is that if I've had any success at all, it's been because millions of other people want to do what I want to do, and that's so helpful.
Great. Thank you.